Something happened this week that may prove far more significant than the headline suggested. It wasn't a missile launch, a battlefield breakthrough, or another round of sanctions. It was a moment during a public appearance when the President of the United States openly acknowledged something that many diplomats and policymakers have been discussing privately for months. America's Middle East strategy may be reaching an inflection point. For decades, Washington's approach to the region has been built on a familiar formula. Military superiority would preserve deterrence. Strategic alliances would maintain regional stability. Economic pressure would influence adversaries. Whenever tensions escalated, the assumption was that American power could ultimately shape the outcome. But history has a habit of challenging assumptions. Empires rarely lose influence because they suddenly become weak. More often, they begin to struggle when long-standing strategies no longer produce the results they once did. Policies that once appeared effective gradually become harder to sustain, while political commitments made years earlier begin generating costs that were never fully anticipated. Many observers believe the events unfolding during the summer of 2026 may represent exactly that kind of moment. To understand why, it helps to begin with one individual whose political career has spanned nearly 3 decades. Benjamin Netanyahu has remained one of the defining figures of Israeli politics since the 1990s. During that time, the Middle East has undergone repeated transformations. Peace negotiations that once dominated international diplomacy gradually faded. Iran expanded both its regional influence and missile capabilities. Non-state armed groups evolved into increasingly sophisticated military organizations. Successive American administrations adopted different tactics. Yet one constant remained the extraordinarily close strategic relationship between Washington and Jerusalem. Few international partnerships have shaped American foreign policy as consistently. Supporters argue that the alliance has provided stability, intelligence cooperation, technological innovation, and a reliable democratic partner in one of the world's most volatile regions. Critics, meanwhile, contend that Washington has sometimes allowed regional strategy to become too closely aligned with the priorities of individual Israeli governments rather than broader American interests. That debate has existed for decades. What makes today's environment different is that it is no longer confined to academic circles or foreign policy journals. It is increasingly entering mainstream political discussion. Recent public opinion surveys conducted across multiple countries suggest that Israel's international standing has declined significantly compared with previous decades. Analysts point to several overlapping reasons, including prolonged military operations, humanitarian concerns, regional instability, and the cumulative impact of multiple conflicts occurring simultaneously. Whatever one's political perspective, one reality has become difficult to ignore. Maintaining international support has become substantially more complicated than it once was. At the same time, the United States has found itself carrying a growing share of the diplomatic, military, and financial burden associated with regional crises. That burden became especially visible during the confrontation involving Iran earlier this year. Officially, the military campaign focused on degrading strategic capabilities and reducing future security threats. Public statements emphasized deterrence, regional security, and preventing further escalation. Yet beneath those stated objectives lay a much broader strategic question. Could military pressure fundamentally reshape Iran's behavior, or even reshape the Iranian political system itself? Many analysts remain deeply skeptical. Iran is not an isolated state with limited strategic depth. It is a country of roughly 90 million people, possessing an extensive missile program, a large domestic industrial base, and decades of experience adapting to sanctions of external pressure. Its leadership has repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to absorb significant economic costs while continuing to pursue long-term strategic objectives. Equally important is Iran's historical memory. Events such as the 1953 coup remain deeply embedded within Iranian political discourse, influencing how both officials and much of the public interpret outside intervention, regardless of ideological differences inside the country. Questions involving national sovereignty often generate far broader domestic consensus than outside observers sometimes expect. That reality complicates any strategy built around rapid political transformation. History offers numerous examples suggesting that external military pressure rarely produces predictable political outcomes. In some cases, governments weaken. In others, outside pressure strengthens domestic cohesion instead. The outcome often depends less on military capability than on political legitimacy, national identity, and the ability of institutions to adapt under stress. These uncertainties became increasingly important as the conflict expanded beyond direct military exchanges. The Strait of Hormuz once again emerged as one of the world's most strategically significant waterways. Nearly 1-5th of globally traded oil moves through this narrow maritime corridor. Every disruption immediately affects shipping costs, insurance rates, commodity markets, and ultimately consumer prices around the world. For countries far removed from the Middle East, the consequences were nevertheless immediate. Energy prices fluctuated. Supply chains tightened. Shipping companies adjusted routes. Governments began quietly urging all parties to reduce tensions before the economic consequences spread even further. This broader international pressure created a strategic environment very different from the opening weeks of the crisis. Instead of focusing solely on military objectives, policymakers increasingly faced questions about economic sustainability. How long could regional instability continue without imposing unacceptable costs on allies, trading partners, and domestic economies? Inside Washington, those questions carried additional political weight. American voters have shown growing fatigue with prolonged overseas military commitments for more than a decade. While public opinion often supports limited military action under specific circumstances, sustained regional conflicts tend to receive far less enthusiasm once economic consequences begin reaching everyday households. Energy prices, inflation, shipping costs, financial markets. These issues affect voters much more directly than abstract geopolitical objectives. For any administration, those domestic realities inevitably become part of the strategic calculation. This helps explain why recent diplomatic activity has accelerated. Reports indicating partial maritime reopening, renewed indirect negotiations, and discussions involving frozen financial assets suggest that multiple governments are now searching for mechanisms capable of reducing tensions without requiring either side to declare outright defeat. Whether those efforts ultimately succeed remains uncertain. Ceasefires can stabilize situations. They can also simply create pauses before the next round of confrontation. What matters most is whether the underlying strategic incentives have actually changed. And that is precisely the question now facing policymakers on every side of the conflict. If the immediate military phase of the crisis is beginning to slow, the strategic questions are only becoming more complicated. History suggests that ending a war is often far more difficult than starting one. Military operations can be planned over weeks or months. Rebuilding political trust, restoring economic stability, and creating durable security arrangements frequently take years. That is where the current situation appears to be heading. Reports over recent weeks indicate that commercial shipping has gradually resumed through parts of the Strait of Hormuz. Financial discussions involving frozen Iranian assets have also begun receiving renewed attention, while indirect diplomatic channels appear more active than they were only a few months ago. None of these developments should be mistaken for a comprehensive settlement. Instead, they suggest something more modest but equally important: a recognition among multiple governments that continued escalation carries costs which no single participant can fully control. Those costs extend far beyond the Middle East. Energy markets remain tightly connected to geopolitical risk. Insurance premiums for commercial shipping respond almost immediately to regional instability. Manufacturing supply chains, already stretched by years of global disruption, become even more vulnerable whenever the world's critical maritime choke points is threatened. For Washington, this creates an increasingly difficult balancing act. On one hand, the United States remains committed to supporting long-standing regional partners and maintaining freedom of navigation. On the other, every additional military commitment competes with growing strategic priorities elsewhere, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, where policymakers increasingly describe long-term competition with China as the defining geopolitical challenge of the coming decades. Resources are not unlimited. Neither is political attention. Every aircraft carrier deployed to one region cannot simultaneously operate in another. Every diplomatic crisis demands time from decision-makers already confronting multiple global challenges at once. This broader strategic reality may ultimately prove more influential than any individual military operation. It also helps explain why discussions inside Washington appear to be evolving. For years, American debates surrounding the Middle East often focused on immediate security concerns: missile attacks, terrorist organizations, nuclear negotiations, or regional proxy conflicts. Increasingly, however, analysts are asking a different question. What is the long-term objective? If the goal is deterrence, what level of military presence is actually required? If the goal is regional stability, can military tools alone produce it? And perhaps most importantly, how should American national interest be defined when allies and partners occasionally pursue objectives that are not perfectly aligned with Washington's own strategic priorities? These questions are uncomfortable precisely because they have no simple answers. Alliances are rarely relationships of complete agreement. Even the closest partners often differ over tactics, timing, and acceptable levels of risk. Throughout modern history, successful alliances have depended not on identical interests but on constant negotiation between overlapping priorities. That process becomes significantly more difficult during periods of prolonged conflict. Recent events have highlighted another important reality. Domestic politics increasingly shapes international strategy. Political leaders in every democracy must balance foreign policy objectives with public opinion, economic performance, electoral considerations, and institutional constraints. Decisions made in foreign capitals rarely remain foreign for long. Higher fuel prices eventually become domestic political issues. Supply chain disruptions affect businesses and consumers. Military commitments influence defense budgets and congressional debates. The separation between foreign and domestic policy has become increasingly blurred. This may explain why rhetoric surrounding the current crisis has begun changing. Public statements now emphasize diplomacy alongside deterrence. Discussions increasingly focus on regional stability rather than decisive military victory. Economic resilience has become almost as prominent as battlefield developments. These changes do not necessarily indicate a fundamental shift in American strategy. They may simply reflect an adaptation to evolving circumstances. Still, adaptation itself is significant. Grand strategy succeeds not because it never changes, but because it recognizes when changing realities require different approaches. Whether that recognition has fully occurred remains uncertain. Israel also faces its own complex strategic calculations. Military superiority provides important advantages, but it cannot eliminate every security challenge. Long-term regional stability ultimately depends upon political relationships as much as military capability. Likewise, Iran continues confronting severe economic pressures despite demonstrating considerable resilience under sanctions. Neither side has achieved all of its objectives. Neither side appears capable of imposing a comprehensive solution solely through force. That leaves diplomacy not necessarily because every participant prefers it, but because the alternatives have become increasingly costly. History repeatedly demonstrates that negotiations often begin only after all parties recognize the limits of military escalation. That recognition may now be emergent. Whether it proves durable is another question entirely. The coming months will likely revolve around several interconnected issues. Can maritime security remain stable enough to protect global commerce? Can nuclear negotiations produce meaningful confidence minus building measures? Can regional powers avoid incidents that unintentionally trigger another cycle of escalation? And perhaps most importantly, can the United States redefine its regional strategy in a way that balances alliance commitments with broader global priorities? None of those questions will be answered quickly. International politics rarely moves in straight lines. Periods of apparent progress can reverse unexpectedly. Temporary ceasefires sometimes become lasting agreements, while seemingly stable arrangements can collapse with little warning. That uncertainty is exactly why analysts remain cautious. The headlines may suggest that the immediate crisis is easing. The deeper structural issues, however, remain resolved. Iran's regional ambitions have not disappeared. Israel's security concerns remain substantial. American strategic commitments continue to expand across multiple theaters simultaneously, and global economic dependence on secure maritime trade routes remains exactly as significant as it was before the first missile was launched. Perhaps the most important lesson from the events of 2026 is not about any single country. It is about the limits of power itself. Military strength can deter adversaries. Economic sanctions can impose meaningful pressure. Diplomatic alliances can provide extraordinary advantages, but none of those instruments can permanently substitute for a sustainable political strategy. Eventually, every major power reaches a point where it must ask not only whether it possesses the ability to act, but whether continued action actually advances its long-term interests. That question now appears to be confronting every major participant in the Middle East. The answers will shape not only the future of the region, but potentially the broader international order that emerges during the remainder of this decade. For now, commercial vessels are once again moving through one of the world's most important waterways. Diplomatic channels remain open. Military forces remain on alert. Financial negotiations continue behind closed doors. The immediate crisis may be slowing. The strategic debate has only just begun, and history will likely judge the next phase not by who fired the last missile, but by whether today's leaders can transform a temporary pause into a more durable framework for regional stability. Because in international politics, the most consequential victories are often not won on the battlefield. They are secured afterward at the negotiating table, through institutions, and by decisions that prevent the next conflict before it begins.